kindergartners. Today we're going to read the last book in our text set called The Place You Call Home. Remember, we read House is a House for Me, we read Houses and Homes, and we read Two Homes. And today's book is called The Little House. So as we're reading this book today, I really want you to think about characters. And we learned at school a while back that characters can be people, they can be animals, and they can even be things. But they are only a character if they have feelings. So they have to actually either be doing something, saying something, or feeling something that is important in the story. So in this case, in the book The Little House is actually a character because she has feelings throughout the story, and her feelings change depending on what is happening in the story. So I want you to really pay attention to the little house and her feelings and how they change in the story. The book, The Little House, is by Virginia Lee Burton. And I see that it won a Caldecott Medal. Did you notice that? It won a Caldecott Medal for its illustrations at some point in time. So Virginia Lee Burton is the author and the illustrator. It says story and pictures by Virginia Lee Burton. So she did this whole book herself. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. She was a pretty little house, and she was strong and well built. The man who built her so well said, "This little house shall never be sold for gold or silver, and she will live to see our great great grandchildren's great great grandchildren living in her." The little house was very happy as she sat on the hill and watched the countryside around her. She watched the sun rise in the morning, and she watched the sun set in the evening. Day followed day, each one a little different from the one before, but the little house stayed just the same. In the nights, she watched the moon grow from a thin new moon to a full moon, then back again to a thin old moon. And when there was no moon, she watched the stars. Way off in the distance, she could see the lights of the city. The little house was curious about the city and wondered what it would be like to live there. So far in the story, I have heard Virginia, the author, tell us that the house was happy and also that the house was curious about the city. Time passed quickly for the little house as she watched the countryside slowly change with the seasons. In the spring, when the days grew longer and the sun warmer, she watched for the first robin to return from the south. She watched the grass turn green. She watched the birds on the trees swell and the I'm going to say that, try that again. She watched the buds on the trees swell and the apple trees burst into blossom. She watched the children playing in the brook. Oh, you see the brook? I think that's the brook right there. Brook is kind of like a stream. Oh, looks like there's some of it over here as well. In the long summer days, she sat in the sun and watched the trees cover themselves with leaves and the white daisies cover the hill. She watched the gardens grow, and she watched the apples turn red and ripen. She watched the children swimming in the pool. Ooh, do you know what season comes next after summer? We went from spring to summer, and after summer, you might be able to guess from Virginia's illustration with all of those beautiful, colorful leaves. It's fall. It looks like fall. In the fall, when the days grew shorter and the nights colder, she watched the first frost turn the leaves to bright yellow and orange and red. She watched the harvest gathered and the apples picked. She watched the children going back to school. In the winter, when the nights were long and the days short and the countryside covered with snow, she watched the children coasting and skating. Year followed year, the apple trees grew old and new ones were planted. The children grew up and went away to the city, and now at night the lights of the city seemed brighter and closer. One day, the little house was surprised to see a horseless carriage coming down the winding country road. Oh, a horseless carriage. Had you noticed all the carriages being pulled by horses before? Yeah, time is passing by. Year after year, things are changing. So this story, the setting of this story was a long time ago. And at the beginning of the story, it was before the time that people had cars. And so they used horse-drawn carriages. And now we can see some things are changing. Pretty soon there were more of them on the road and fewer carriages pulled by horses. Pretty soon along came some surveyors and surveyed a line in front of the little house. Pretty soon along came a steam shovel and dug a road through the hill covered with daisies. Then some trucks came and dumped big stones on the road. Then some trucks with little stones. Then some trucks with tar and sand. And finally, a steamroller came and it rolled it smooth, and the road was done. Now the little house watched the trucks and automobiles going back and forth to the city. Gasoline stations, roadside stands, and small houses followed the new road. Everyone and everything moved much faster now than before. More roads were made, and the countryside was divided into lots. More houses and bigger houses, apartment houses and tenement houses, schools, stores, and garages spread over the land and crowded around the little house. No one wanted to live in her and take care of her anymore. She couldn't be sold for gold or silver, so she just stayed there and watched. How do you think the little house is feeling now? Virginia's not telling us with her words, but can you guess how the little house might feel if no one wants to live in her and her countryside looks like this now? A lot has changed. I think she might be feeling sad and lonely. Now it was not so quiet and peaceful at night. Now the lights of the city were bright and very close, and street lights shone all night. This must be living in the city, thought the little house, and didn't know whether she liked it or not. She missed the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Pretty soon, there were trolley cars going back and forth in front of the little house. They went back and forth all day and part of the night. Everyone seemed to be very busy, and everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Pretty soon, there was an elevated train going back and forth above the little house. The air was filled with dust and smoke, and the noise was so loud that it shook the little house. Now she couldn't tell when spring came, or summer, or fall, or winter. It all seemed about the same. Can you think about why that is? She really can't see anything that would normally give a clue about what season it is. She can't see trees and fields and flowers. Pretty soon, there was a subway going back and forth underneath the little house. She couldn't see it, but she could feel and hear it. People were moving faster and faster. No one noticed the little house anymore. They hurried by without a glance. Pretty soon, they tore down the apartment houses and tenement houses around the little house and started digging big cellars, one on each side. The steam shovels dug down 3 stories on one side and 4 stories on the other side. Pretty soon, they started building up. They built up 25 stories on one side and 35 stories on the other. Now the little house only saw the sun at noon and didn't see the moon or stars at night at all because the lights of the city were too bright. Can you think about why she would only see the sun at noon? Do you know where the sun is when it is noon? When it's noon, the sun is straight up in the sky. So the only time the little house can see it is when it's right above her. She can't see it as it's rising and as it's setting. I bet she feels sad about that. She didn't like living in the city. At night, she used to dream of the country and the fields of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. The little house was very sad and lonely. Her paint was cracked and dirty. Her windows were broken and her shutters hung crookedly. She looked shabby, though she was just as good a house as ever underneath. Then one fine morning in spring, along came the great great granddaughter of the man who built the little house so well. She saw the shabby little house, but she didn't hurry by. There was something about the little house that made her stop and look again. That little house looks just like the little house my grandmother lived in when she was a little girl. Only that little house was way out in the country, on a hill covered with daisies and apple trees growing around. They found out it was the very same house. So they went to the movers to see if the little house could be moved. The movers looked the little house all over and said, "Sure, this house is as good as ever. She's built so well, we could move her anywhere." So they jacked up the little house and put her on wheels. Traffic was held up for hours as they slowly moved her out of the city. At first, the little house was frightened, but after she got used to it, she rather liked it. They rolled along the big road and they rolled along the little roads until they were way out in the country. When the little house saw the green grass and heard the birds singing, she didn't feel sad anymore. They went along and along, but they couldn't seem to find just the right place. They tried the little house here and they tried her there. Finally, they saw a little hill in the middle of a field and apple trees growing around. There, said the great great granddaughter, that's just the place. Yes, it is, said the little house to herself. A cellar was dug on top of the hill, and slowly they moved the house from the road to the hill. So we've heard the word cellar a couple of times. In this case, cellar does not mean someone who is selling something. It means kind of like a basement. So before they put the house down, they're digging underneath the house, a cellar. The windows and shutters were fixed, and once again they painted her a lovely shade of pink. As the little house settled down on her new foundation, she smiled happily. Once again, she could watch the sun and moon and stars. Once again, she could watch spring and summer and fall and winter come and go. Once again, she was lived in and taken care of. Do you think the little house feels happy again? I do. Never again would she be curious about the city. Never again would she want to live there. The stars twinkled above her. A new moon was coming up. It was spring, and all was quiet and peaceful in the country. So, kindergartners, I want you to think about the feelings that our character, the little house, had in this story. And there were a lot of different feelings that you might think about. There were times that she felt happy, and there were times that she felt curious. There were times that she felt sad and lonely, and then a time at the end that she felt happy again. So I'm going to ask you for your writing activity today to draw a picture of the little house and whatever feeling you want to show the little house having, that will help you decide what you should draw around the little house. So if I drew a picture of a little house surrounded by a lot of people and cars and tall buildings, then I would be showing that that was a time in the story the little house felt sad and lonely. And I might even want to draw the little house in that picture to have some paint that doesn't look so good and shutters that are not hanging straight and maybe some broken windows and some things that show that time during the story that she felt sad and what it was like around her. There were other times that she felt happy and she was surrounded by things like apple trees or daisies, green grass on the hillside, and there were people who lived there and took care of her and loved her, and she watched them playing. Um, or perhaps it could be a nighttime picture where she could see the stars twinkling and watch the moon. So you get to decide which part of the story you want to show, but I really want you to think about the feelings that the little house had through the story, and how they changed based on what was happening in the story and where she was. So I'll ask you to do that for your writing activity today, and either show me a video of your picture that you draw or take a photograph of it, and please record your voice explaining to me how the little house was feeling at that part of the story, and a little bit about why, what was around her, where was she at that time. that she was having that feeling. Okay, thank you so much for listening to our story today. We'll start a new text set next time. Thank you.